I just bought every generation of iPad ever, so let's find out how the iPad was originally scrapped, how Apple eventually made it, but then completely ruined the marketing of it, and then how they finally got it all together and crushed the competition. Now, you know what's actually crazy about the first iPad? That this was being worked on all the way back in 2004, and it's only while Apple were making the iPad that they realized, hey, wait a sec, if we scale down this same tech, it could become an absolutely revolutionary phone. And as soon as they realized that, they immediately suspended iPad development and went all in on what would end up becoming the iPhone in 2007. So if you think about it, this is actually the product that Apple originally intended to make, but it took till 2010 for them to eventually do so. Damn, this thing's heavy. So underneath the iPad is an insert with a full-color quick start, manuals, and 2 Apple stickers. Can't even get one of those nowadays. The 30-pin connector and a 10-watt power brick. But there's still a massive question mark hanging over this thing, because the market for tablets was frankly abysmal in 2010. The conventional wisdom was, don't make one. They never work. There weren't any mainstream Android tablets out. Basically, every tablet that existed at this time was just a big, chunky, ill-fated attempt at a new form of Windows PC, which was basically just a laptop that had been sliced in half and given a stylus. Even Apple had their own rocky history with the Newton PDA and its poor handwriting recognition, not to mention a cancelled 1983 project called Bashful, which honestly, it's probably for the best that this one didn't get made. And so the question is, what on earth did Apple do with this tablet to actually change people's minds? 2 things. One, that the iPhone at this point was selling extremely well. So well that it was actually driving the price of components necessary for the iPad down. Meaning that Apple managed to release this as somehow one of the most affordable tablets. And you can tell Steve Jobs fully knew that when he announced that the thing was not going to be $999, but in fact, $499. Listen to that reaction. Wow. And 2, that the way you could interact with the thing was revolutionary. Like I said, practically every tablet at the time had a stylus to mimic the mouse pointer, since they were all just Windows computers. And so when Steve Jobs announced that they managed to scale up the iPhone's capacitive multi-touch interface to work on their tablet, and that all you needed was a finger, I mean, he probably could have just dropped the mic and walked off at that moment. No more things. This was such a new concept that even though it seems so obvious now, Jobs actually needed to show people how to navigate this thing. Not to mention this was the first time you could just rotate on iOS and switch over to landscape mode. Man, using this thing takes me back so much. I remember this being such a desirable gadget. And it's also a sign how much care they put into the user interface that it still holds up today. I would actually go as far as to say that it is still beautiful. And even though the thing is not light, just by being light enough that you can hold it in one hand, intuitive to use and powerful, with the Apple A4 chip making it 3.4 times more powerful than the first iPhone, Apple very quickly put tablets back on people's radars. The iPad sold over 15 million units in total before it was replaced, which, considering the state of the tablet market at the time, makes this a breakout success, leaving Apple with, no joke, 85% of the tablet market. And you know what? I would actually go as far as to say that the iPad 2, just 1 year later, was even more of a revelation. Because if the iPad 1 was an Apple tablet that nailed the fundamentals, then the iPad 2 was a full modernization of those fundamentals, all for that same $499 price. For example, it was thinner. But I don't mean like phones today that might come out 0.2 millimeters thinner than the last one. I mean Apple went from 13.4 millimeters all the way to 8.8. In large part by replacing the original iPad's 2 fatter batteries with 3 flatter batteries, which also allowed them to remove some of the internal plastic support framing. It was the first iPad with cameras, a front 0.3 megapixel and a back 0.7 megapixel, and Apple celebrated that with the launch of Photo Booth on iOS, which no one was using as their main camera, but there was definitely something fun about the fusion of the camera with the iPad's fun bite-sized software. Oh my goodness me. I remember this feeling like people's first taste at what you now get with the practically unlimited Snapchat filters. To think there must have been a point where all of these Apple execs were sitting in a boardroom testing these features. God. iPad 2 had double the RAM at 512 megabytes, and the new dual-core A5 chip ended up making this about 2.5 times faster than the original iPad. So let me try and load up the same web page on both. This was like the classic comparison everyone wanted to see at the time. Let's go Samsung.com. 3, 2, 1, go. What? Safari cannot open the page because it could not establish a secure connection to the server. What are they trying to say about Samsung? Apple.com. 3, 2, 1, go. Oh. Well, the iPad 2 has already started to load the page. iPad 1 is still going, there you go. Although neither can actually load the full page. Not to mention, this is where Apple introduced smart covers, automatically putting the iPad in sleep mode when closed while cleaning the screen with their microfiber cloth backing. This doesn't normally happen with sequel products, but the iPad 2 was such a huge leap that this specifically became an icon, even more so than the original, so much so that this was still being sold up until 2014 as the entry-level iPad, even outlasting the 3 and the 4. But it's with this third iPad that things start to get a little strange. See, logic would dictate that if your iPad sold well, your iPad 2 sold gangbusters, that all you have to do is to keep making the same kinds of improvements and to call it the iPad 3. What Apple actually did was call this new iPad the new iPad. Bruh. What? This will never make sense to me. How can any product ever be named the new something? Because what do they think happens when it's not new anymore? Hey, I'm here to repair my new iPad. Oh, you got the new iPad? Yeah. Well, I mean, I got it like 3 years ago. You got the new iPad 3 years ago. Yep. Are you sure it's not the new old iPad? Well, it's not, the new iPad, but it is the new iPad, if you get me. I'm not paid enough for this. The key new thing this time was after Apple saw the reaction to the Retina display on their iPhone 4, they knew that they had to bring that tech to the iPads too. And it was an especially massive jump here because there was already a lot of pixels to start with. This brought the iPad up to one of the highest resolution displays on the market, full stop. I mean, just look at the difference in the Safari icon. This kind of clarity would have felt surreal in 2012. So that part of it was great. It's just basically the rest of it. Like the A5 chip in the iPad 2 became the A5X in the iPad 3, which was frankly a tiny improvement. This iPad had the same amount of storage, the same 30-pin connector. I mean, it looks identical. It was the first iPad technically with support for LTE networks, but even that was a problem. Despite advertising the iPad 3 as a 4G LTE device, it actually couldn't communicate with LTE networks outside of the US due to the use of different radio frequencies, which led to Apple being sued across multiple countries. And at the same time, while Apple was starting to get comfortable, the Android competition was starting to heat up. Up until this point, yes, there had been plenty of Android tablets, but they were awfully optimized. They were so buggy and laggy that they'd actually created a bad reputation for Android tablets as just the knockoff alternative to iPad. But Google was paying very close attention to the surprising take-up of the iPad, and they invested very heavily around this time in creating a tablet-optimized version of Android. Android 3.0, Honeycomb. Man, it feels so good to talk about this again. These Honeycomb tablets were actually something I was covering in the very early days of this channel, and they were great. You could find something at every price point. They were way more customizable than Apple, and since they were now running a software that was specifically designed for tablets, they actually used the large available screen space better. Plus, by the time Android 4.0 rolled out, Google was also starting to fix the single main thing holding Android back: the lag, which all put together meant that Apple's market share was tumbling fast, all the way from 85% the year of the first iPad to 44% now. And I think seeing all of this happen, Apple started to get a little bitter. They felt like they were the ones who started this whole smartphone and smart tablet thing, and everyone else was just copying them, particularly Samsung. So it's at this point that Apple decided to try and sue them. They claimed that Samsung copied everything from the design to the screen icons and even core patented features like tap to zoom and bounce back, which allows your screen to show the surface beneath a document. The funny part of this, though, is that that failed because the High Court ruled that there was no way any consumer would ever confuse the two devices because Samsung was, and I quote, not as cool. So, I mean, no one really wins here. But this ended up being just the beginning of what would become the absolutely brutal 7-year suing and countersuing conquest between these two companies. And the waters only got muddier later that same year, because it wasn't just full-size Android tablets that were starting to become popular. It was smaller 7-inch ones too. Because remember, most phone screens at this time were still only like 4 inches. Now, Steve Jobs had historically hated this idea. He believed that users needed the iPad's larger 9.7-inch screen to actually do anything useful. But there was another Apple exec, Eddie Q, who had been pushing for a 7-inch iPad since 2011 through internal emails, and eventually he won Jobs over. I think it's so fascinating to see how Apple was thinking at the time. Look at this. Subject: why I just dumped the iPad. Hint: size matters. Having used a Samsung Galaxy, I agree with many of the comments below. I believe there will be a 7-inch market, and we should do one. And so, alongside the next generation iPad 4, which yes, came out the same year as the iPad 3, new iPad, Apple also released the iPad mini. And to be completely honest, I don't think it was all that exciting. Apple had clearly decided that the kind of user who'd be looking for a mini tablet wasn't someone who would care about the cutting edge. So the iPad mini is basically just a tiny iPad 2 in terms of specs, and it came out at $329. The cool part though is that yes, even though this was just an iPad 2 on the inside, the thinner display technology available now and the new unibody outer shell, which had fewer parts, meant that instead of the iPad mini being thicker than the iPad 2, like you would expect given that it's shorter and narrower, it's actually thinner too. This thing is just 7.2 millimeters thin, much thinner than Apple's competitors at the time, like the Google Nexus 7 and the Amazon Fire HD, the former being arguably the first major Android tablet success story. And for the market they were targeting, this was absolutely the right thing to focus on. It meant that this technically inferior iPad mini actually far outsold the iPad 4 that it released alongside. Supply chain numbers suggest that Apple was restocking this thing at 2 times the rate, which you could sort of see coming from the moment the iPad mini was first unveiled on stage. Oh yeah, this is also where Apple introduced the Lightning port to the iPad, which in one sense felt like the future. It could support higher transfer speeds, faster charging, it was way neater and less bulky, and unlike the industry standard micro USB at the time, completely reversible. But on the other hand, users and reviewers weren't completely jazzed that Apple had gone from one self-made proprietary cable straight to another, making the old cable obsolete and requiring a whole new set of accessories. Oh, unless you pick up the $30 adapter. But the 4th gen full-size iPad was still the true flagship of 2012. And since Apple attributed a lot of the iPad's success so far to its pricing, they kept it again. For the 4th year in a row, this was $499. Even though when you factor in inflation, that's actually about 20% cheaper than the first model. Also a lightning cable here, and the machine itself. Which actually sparked quite a bit of drama from people who just bought the previous gen, only to have this thing drop 7 months later. Feels particularly cruel given the naming on that iPad. This was a massive chipset upgrade from the A5X to the A6X, which made this about 2.5 times more powerful than the iPad 3, and so about 6.5 times more powerful than the original iPad. But apart from that, and upgrading the front camera from 0.3 to 1.2 megapixel, there is basically nothing new. It's literally iPad 3. Maybe they should have just called this the newer iPad. Do you know what they actually called it? iPad 4 was officially sold under the name iPad with Retina display, even though they just previously released the iPad with Retina display. So you took the old feature from the new iPad, that's really now the old iPad, and used it to name the actually new iPad. Apple, what are you doing? I think it's pretty clear that Apple themselves were confused with what to do with iPad. You could tell that all of this was not one person calling the shots, but a divided boardroom. And if anything reinforces that idea, is the fact that the following year, instead of a 5th generation iPad, Apple instead released yet another new category, the iPad Air. I remember seeing this thing get announced on stage. Apple called this the biggest step yet in achieving the vision of the iPad, and the crowd seemed pretty happy about it. Now obviously, to invent a whole new name for this iPad, it must be a lot thinner and lighter, right? Well yes, actually. The very first iPad was 680 grams, the most recent iPad 4 was 652 grams, the iPad Air was just 469. And making that much of a change to what was already a very optimized design, that requires a lot of work. Apple had to eliminate the air gap between the front glass and the LCD panel, which also at the same time improves the picture quality. The aluminium frame was slimmer, and these smaller size bezels, they were not just an aesthetic win, but also meant that you need less material. But the thing that made the most difference? Apple shrunk the battery by a good 30%, but still managed to keep the same end battery life through a pretty massive leap in efficiency with their new A7 chip. That also happened to double the performance of the last iPad. These numbers are really, really impressive. And so even though this might look just like an upsized iPad mini, it's the power and the branding of iPad Air that I think was a big part of the thing's success. I think Air just makes it feel very clearly new. You felt like you were buying something that was distinctly impossible the last year. But I think the most interesting part of this is that the iPad Air launched with iOS 7, the first ever major iOS redesign. And on one hand, this just feels right. Apple's lightest iPad, releasing alongside their lightest feeling software. iOS 7 got rid of all complicated 3D shapes and replaced them with nearly shadowless flat icons, thinner text, and plainer backgrounds. I remember my friends showing me the new iOS in the playground and it distinctly feeling like the future. This flat design was what the entire industry was moving towards at the time. But when I look back, I also can't help but feel like the original iOS icons had so much more charm. iOS 7 also does feel a bit characterless by comparison. But this is where things get taken up another notch, because in all this time making iPads, there's one thing that Apple hadn't tried yet. We've had iPad but small, we've had iPad but thin, and in 2015, Apple decided it was time for iPad but big, and not just in size. This is the absolutely ginormous iPad Pro, the big daddy of iPads. I could not for the life of me find one of these brand new, by the way, so this one is used, but barely. Now, credit where credit's due. I actually think it's pretty great that Apple managed to, at first, release the iPad at $499 and then keep hitting that price year after year while making the product significantly better. That said, Pro is where the company makes up for that lost ground, with a starting price of $799. So this needs to be a massive improvement. And, well, you got a new chip, the A9X, which is a very healthy 1.9x improvement over the previous AA techs that Apple used in the iPad Air 2, and an enormous 3.4x jump over the A7 in the original iPad Air. But at the same time, if the iPad Airs are getting these super high-performance X-series chips, then what's actually Pro about the iPad Pro? Well, it's massive. This 12.9-inch display is practically laptop-sized. We now have a quad speaker setup, which, actually, let's do a quick demo. So this is the iPad Air. It's actually pretty good, although highly directional considering that the speakers both face downwards. And then with the iPad Pro, we move from 2 to 4 speakers, and they are all around the device. It's not that much louder, but it's way more immersive. There's a camera upgrade to 8 megapixel, which I'm sure is exactly what the pros were pining for, and the introduction of this, the Apple Pencil, which is particularly interesting because styluses are something that Steve Jobs used to hate.
You have to get them and put them away and you lose them. Yuck.
Plus, does it not feel like the entire existence of the iPad Pro was something Steve Jobs would have questioned? The way that he saw the world was big old PC computers were like trucks. There'd always be some people who need them, but that's a minority. The majority of people will use cars. And in this analogy, Jobs saw the iPad as the car. And so in a way, this iPad Pro makes a lot of sense. Of course, you'll have some people who don't want a truck, but do want a more souped-up Pro car. But then, isn't that what the MacBook is for? And you're about to see the relationship between these two products get more and more murky. Also, I find this so cool. Let's say you're finding your existing wallpaper a little bit too bland. If I pull up the Opera browser, our sponsor, make me an iPad wallpaper in this style, but more colorful and bolder. See what it spits out. Whey! And bam. It looks like a really nice evolution of the original. And Opera just got an update too, which now gives you a movable music player, dynamic themes which go absolutely crazy and are fully customizable, but also they have basically fixed the hassle of manually resizing windows while trying to multitask with split screen. Not to mention, I'm a big believer in the whole clear room, clear mind philosophy. I don't work well with mess around me. And that's a big part of why I gravitate towards Opera, because tab islands let you stay completely organized and therefore very much in the zone, even if your room isn't. Link below to download the Opera browser for free. Now, Apple did release a Pro 2nd generation in 2017, but it was a pretty unexciting incremental upgrade. It's only in 2018 when things got really interesting. This is the iPad Pro 3rd gen, now at $999. And the way that Apple justified this second major price hike is that this was a complete redesign. And you can tell, gone are the uber minimalist boxes of old. The new iPad was all about color. This is where Apple decided that the kinds of people that the Pro iPad should appeal to were creatives, so they really leaned into that. You got the iPad. The insert does still have the same stuff in it as the very first model, but you can tell they've really neatened up the presentation of everything. There's now a USB-C cable, which I'm getting to, and the iPad itself, which has not just a new design, but equally as exciting, a new matte packaging. Extra crispy. Now, I have to say, I noticed a change in Apple around this time. Partly, I think, because iPad market share was falling, hitting just 24% in 2015 because of more competition from Samsung and Lenovo, and iPhones now being offered in larger phablet sizes. And partly because this is where Apple's mobile A-series chipsets started to get really fast. Put these two things together, and this is where you notice Apple starting to go straight for the computer users. Right from the very launch event of the iPad Pro 3, they touted how the new A12 A12X Bionic processor was faster than 92% of portable PCs, with overall system performance 2.8 times faster than the Gen 1 iPad Pro, making it around 124 times faster than the very first iPad and 421 times faster than the first iPhone. Not to mention, this was the first iPad with a USB-C port, and the EU didn't even need to tell them to do it. This was clearly part of the new Apple strategy, where the iPad was pitched as a great alternative to a Windows computer, with this port allowing it to be hooked up to a 5K resolution monitor, as well as giving it compatibility with a whole bunch of Pro accessories. The storage capacity was now up to 1 terabyte. This is the first iPad with Face ID, so out with the home button. We got a 120Hz ProMotion display, and also just generally, this is just such a nice neatening and sharpening up of the way that iPad looks. It feels way more intentional now. But the main reason this iPad was such big news for me, a massive reduction, and just as important, evening of the bezels around the screen. This moved the iPad from tablet to magic sheet of glass, as Apple calls it, because you can use it just as easily from every angle. And you know what? This new Windows laptop targeting strategy was actually kind of working. Apple's market share started to pick up once again. So they kept doubling down on this mantra with the iPad Pro 4 in 2020. Your next computer is not a computer, they said. It came with massively upgraded cameras, a new LiDAR sensor, which in hindsight was quite a few years too early to be of much use to any consumer, and then the A12Z Bionic chipset. God, Apple, please stick to one naming convention, I'm begging you. And it made basically no difference to performance. One pretty large development was the new Magic Keyboard you could get with it, which also included a trackpad. You sure it's not a computer, Tim? But this was especially strange since the selfie camera which you'd be using for calls was still on the top edge, which made no sense since Apple were clearly trying to push you to use the device horizontally. The biggest change, though, between the last iPad and this one is the iPad's second big software overhaul, iPadOS. It's hard to believe, but up until this point, every iPad was just running the same iOS that iPhones are running. But in order to target their appeal to computer users, Apple had to convince them that they were getting more than just what their phones already could do. So, iPadOS launched with a redesigned home screen that could fit more apps. Long overdue, but it did fix the frankly ridiculous-looking spacing that iPads had up until this point. There's new widgets. Safari would now also automatically give you the desktop version of sites, scaled for the iPad display and optimized for touch. It wasn't immediately a massive change, but it needed to happen eventually, since the way people use their phones is very different to the way they use their tablets. Before long, Apple's market share was back up to 38%, helped in part thanks to a growing middle class in emerging markets who could actually afford their premium product. At which point Apple decided, you know what? It's time for another price hike. $1,099 was what the 2021 iPad Pro 5th Gen launched at. And to well and truly solidify that not a computer, but basically a computer was the direction that Apple wanted to go in, this time around, Apple actually managed to squeeze in the M1 laptop-grade chip inside of the iPad. The entire history of iPads thus far have been powered by A-series chips, the same series of chips that go into your phone. But as the latest attempt to try and get away from the reputation of the iPad just being a Netflix machine, this time they tried to focus on giving you something different under the hood. Now, in a way, this is all a little arbitrary. The M-series chips are based on the same architecture as the A-series chips, they're just beefed up. But then that's like any other normal chip upgrade would be anyways. This iPad is about 1.5 times faster than the last gen, but still, considering that Apple's tablets were already at this point far more powerful than most Android competition, sticking another 50% onto that lead is still kind of a lot. That said, cool as it is to have an M1 chip and the now up to 16 gigabytes of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage this behemoth of a tablet can come with, I don't know who exactly was using it to its limit on an iPad, given that the base software is still not that far off iPhone software. To return to the Steve Jobs analogy, this combination of chip and product is a bit like taking the engine of a truck and sticking it into a car. The car still can't go above the speed limit, and it's never going to need to carry more than 5 people because they won't fit inside it anyway. One thing that everyone could appreciate though is this new screen. In one fell swoop, it was goodbye to the IPS LCD panels of old. Hello, mini LED Liquid Retina XDR. God, Apple, can you just please name things in plain English. But this basically means that instead of one big backlight, this display has thousands of mini LEDs, each with their own backlight, allowing for way higher peak brightness. Also, big upgrade to the front-facing camera. It's now a 12 megapixel ultra-wide, specifically to allow for a new Apple feature called Center Stage, where the camera can follow you around a room. I wish the camera could literally follow me to the correct side of the device though. The 2022 iPads were when Apple started to eco up their packaging. So you'll notice no outside plastic wrap. That's part of the fun gone, but you can tell they have still obsessed over how to still give this thing that fresh new product feeling. We got the same insert, the same power brick. Oh, but now the USB-C cable is braided, which is an important improvement for durability and tangle resistance, something the original Apple cables were pretty notorious for. Gotta say, they have done a pretty slick job swapping out the plastic for fiber, while still retaining that crispy, fresh iPad feeling. Now, aside from one admittedly cool upgrade to the Apple Pencil, which now shows a digital shadow above your screen when you hover, this iPad basically just existed for people who like to say that my iPad has more M's than yours. It had an M2 chip instead of an M1, making it 1.2 times more powerful. But you know what? As strange as Apple's product strategy is starting to feel, with their quest to take on Windows laptops actually just making them feel more and more like MacBooks each year, the market share has just kept climbing, with the iPad Pro becoming Apple's best-selling iPad, and Apple ending 2022 with 46% of the market. The way that I think Apple's looking at this is, yes, every time we give the iPad a new Pro feature, we are slightly cannibalizing the MacBook. But at the same time, we're making the iPad less pointless. And I think the way Apple sees it, the iPad has a way better chance than the MacBook of becoming the best-selling mainstream computer. But the 7th generation really feels like the crowning jewel of the iPad line. And it's at this point where they've fully given the iPad packaging the iPhone treatment. It's far thinner. Inside you got the iPad, surprisingly similar layout internally. It's just now you get no power brick. I do like this though, a black braided cable to match the black iPad color I've gone for. And let's be very clear, I think this device is bordering on a miracle, to be honest. It is 5.1 millimeters thick for starters. Just look at this versus the original iPad. The difference is phenomenal. And like I said earlier, I'm not as fussed when it comes to the thickness of a phone. But on a 13-inch tablet, where it's the difference between being comfortable with two hands and being comfortable to use with just one hand, it matters. It's got a tandem OLED display, which means that instead of just one layer of backlit lighting, this screen now has two stacked on top of each other, so the brightness is unexpectedly high. Amusingly, Apple actually downgraded the cameras, and they kind of tried to hide it, as you can see, because the ultra-wide camera was here, and they just swapped it for the LiDAR sensor, which was previously here. But they have finally fixed the front camera by sticking it on the landscape side. Not to mention the new Apple Pencil Pro, which now lets you squeeze to bring up new tools and barrel roll to rotate the part of the nib you're drawing with. It really does feel like Apple bottled up 2 generations worth of upgrades into one here. Which reminds me, it's kind of crazy how far the iPad has come from Steve Jobs' original vision, both in ways that would have amazed him. How the thing practically started off as a portable email machine, and now it's a almost do whatever you want machine, but maybe also appalled by with all this Apple Pencil stuff. And to be fair, his original complaint of you needing a place to put the pencil still holds true, because the thing does just fall off when you rattle it. Oh yeah, and if you liked being able to brag about the number 2 before, oh boy, you must have been very excited when they announced that these iPads somehow got the M4 chip before the MacBooks. This is stupidly powerful for its diminutive thickness. A further 1.5x more powerful than the previous Pro, 345 times more powerful than the iPad 1, and astonishingly about 1,170 times more powerful than the original iPhone. But I have covered this in a separate video in detail if you want to see that. So yeah, this has been an absolute monster of a video to put together, especially with all of this new house stuff going on. Like, this is the 4th first-gen iPad that we've had to buy to actually get one that works. So, hope you liked it, and I will catch you in the next one. Oh yeah, and before the comments, this is not the next-gen Mr. Who's the Boss studio. This is a cinema room.